Okay, so in this lab, what we're going to do is we're going to create a VPC endpoint. And VPC endpoints serve a purpose for instances, in this example, in a private subnet. So as you can see from this diagram, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to create a virtual private cloud in two availability zones, right? The one availability zone will be the public subnet. Second availability zone will be the private subnet. So what makes a public subnet, right? You may ask, well, what defines, a public and private subnet in AWS? Well, the answer is when you attach the gateway to that subnet and make that route association, right? So you make that subnet association to that route. And then from that route, you say the quad 0 address, right? Anything other than the default address for the whole virtual private cloud, send it to the gateway. Again, so that makes your subnet public because it's assumed that once you have an internet gateway, then your Amazon EC2 is going to have a public IP address. And so I'll kind of go over that with the lab. But if you look at the top part with the public subnet, we've done this many times, right? We've created a public subnet. We placed an EC2 in the public subnet, right? That has an internet gateway. So traffic, right? We created route tables that say traffic outside the virtual private cloud, right? With that quad 0 address is to be routed to the internet gateway, right? Which in turn can route it to the internet or the Amazon network, right? Which is by definition the internet. You could see the cloud up there. So when we create S3 buckets, again, you have to remember they're not part of our virtual private cloud. Yes, it's our S3 bucket, but it's inside the Amazon network. It's not inside your virtual private cloud. Okay, so what about private instances, right? So Amazon EC2 instances in a private subnet have no gateway and have no public IP address. They just have a private IP. Well, how do they get out to the internet? The only way they can get out to the internet is where you see that X is you create a VPC endpoint. So once that VPC endpoint is created, then traffic from the private subnet goes to the VPC endpoint to the S3 bucket. You don't need a public IP to access the internet or Amazon network if you use an endpoint. So that's the purpose of them, right? They serve private subnets. Otherwise, right, if you have an EC2 instance with just a private IP, right, if you're not going to create an endpoint, what would you need? I mean, think about it for a second. You would need a NAT gateway, right? And that NAT gateway has an elastic permanent public IP, so you're incurring charges 24/7. And the costs are much cheaper when you use a VPC endpoint, okay? Because again, no public IP address is needed. Okay, that endpoint serves as your interface between the Amazon network that you see on the right side and your virtual private cloud that you see on the left side in this diagram. And so the charges are nominal. So I believe it's like if you want to, like, for example, upload files from an Amazon EC2 to an S3 bucket, then you're looking at something, it's like 9 cents per gigabyte. It's relatively cheap. Internet gateways are actually cheaper, but there are times where your Amazon EC2 must reside in a private subnet. Okay, so again, we're going to kind of look at the bottom screen when we create our VPC subnet. Let's just go ahead and get started with the lab. In this lab, we're going to do a couple of things, right? We're going to set up our virtual private cloud, okay? And then after we set up our virtual private cloud with the public and private subnets, what we're going to do is create a VPC endpoint. We're going to secure shell in to our Amazon EC2 in the public subnet, right? And once we have a secure shell session, we'll create files on that Amazon EC2 in the public subnet, and we'll send files or upload them to the S3 bucket that goes through the internet gateway. So you'll see how that works, and we'll verify that on the S3. And then likewise, we will go to the private subnet. And how we go to the private subnet, because you can't access the private subnet via PuTTY because it has a private IP from your home computer. So how do you access it? Well, one way to access it is simply SSH into the public subnet. And then once you're into the public subnet, EC2 SSH or connect to the private subnet that the Amazon EC2 resides in. And you could do that through a PuTTY session, because you got to remember that's possible. The Amazon EC2 in the public subnet has a private IP address as well. So it can communicate, the public and private subnet can communicate without the need for an internet gateway or a VPC endpoint. And we'll kind of show you how it works. And then the last thing we'll do is we'll enable versioning on Amazon S3. So as multiple copies of files are uploaded, they're not replaced. You just get you create a file name, call it document 1, and you upload it to an S3 bucket, and you make changes to that file without versioning, and you upload it, it gets replaced, right? If you don't enable versioning. So you only have one document continuously that's updated. Well, what if you want to keep older versions, right, with the same file name? Give you an example. Maybe you're a polling agency, and every day you're polling, right, because we got a presidential election coming up. It may be over by the time you do this lab, but what if you want to do polling every day and compare the results and look at the old files? It's just an example. Operating system versions as well. So we'll enable versioning that will allow us to edit documents, for example, upload them with the same file name, and you'll have 2 documents with the same file name. And you'll see how that works. And then you can create a lifecycle policy for these older documents. You could say, after X amount of days, store them take them from Amazon S3 and go ahead and store them in Amazon Glacier, for example, or Amazon S3 standard and frequent access. So, and you'll get to see how that works. We'll just verify it all at the end. So let's go ahead and get started, and we'll create our VPC. Okay, and that's my video recording window. I'm already in the console home. And again, you'll access this through your Academy Learner Lab. Okay, not the Introduction to the Cloud 2 Academy, but the AWS Academy course I just created, right? So there was one other lab in this course that you could use to access this Learner Lab. All right, so you go to your Academy Learner Lab, right? You click Start Lab, you wait for the Amazon light to go green, and you click on it, and you'll end up here at Console Home. So let's just go ahead and create our VPCs. We'll type VPC. And we'll just click on VPCs. Okay, now this is the default VPC. You know what? We're going to leave this as is, just to show you how you don't have to clean it all up. You're given a default VPC, and you're given default subnets for that VPC. You're given a main route table for that VPC. And yes, you're actually given an internet gateway. So everything could be set up for you. But we're going to create our own, and we'll click on Create VPC. Make sure it reads VPC only. And we'll call it Endpoint Lab, Endpoint-Lab-VPC. Okay, IPv4 manual input. The seeder block for the VPC will be 10.0.0/16. We've done this numerous times. Tennessee will be left at default, and we'll select Create VPC. Okay, now if you click on your VPCs, okay, it's got a name, and it's got a parent Class A address that it belongs to. Okay, notice we haven't created a route main table for it yet, and it's not our default VPC, which is okay. And so we'll create our subnets. Now again, look at the subnet. We'll create a public subnet. We'll address it with 10.0.1.0/24 in the public. And then for the private, it'll be 10.0.2.0/24 for the private. Okay, and we already created the big virtual private cloud. Okay, next step, right? Click Create Subnet. Select the Endpoint Lab VPC, and we'll give it a name. So we'll do the public subnet first, public-subnet. Stop from the top. And again, we're going to place them in different availability zones. So this will be US East 1A, and this will be US East 1B. So where was I? So here we go. We click on US East 1A. Okay, and for the IPv4 subnet, we're going to type 10.0.1.0/24. Okay, which is our public subnet. We'll go create subnet. And we'll create the private subnet in a different availability zone, but it's got to be the same within the same VPC. So click on Endpoint Lab VPC, and we'll call this private subnet. And we'll put this in US East 1B. Okay. And the IPv4 subnet Cedar block will be 10.0.2.0/24. And we'll select Create Subnet. Okay. And so if we click on VPCs and click on subnets again, okay, there they are. Okay, the public is 10.0.1 and the private is 10.0.2. Okay, next step, right? We're going to create an internet gateway. How do we, now right now, technically, it says public subnet, but it's not a public subnet yet till we attach a gateway to it, okay? So we create an internet gateway. We click on gateways, and we'll just call it Endpoint Gateway, IGW, okay? And we'll create it. And then we'll attach it to our VPC. So click on Attach, select your VPC, Endpoint Lab VPC, and attach it. Okay. Now we go to the route tables, okay? We're going to create a public route table. And there's a default one for the default VPC. So we'll click on Create Route Table, and we'll call it public-RT. We'll select our VPC, which is Endpoint Lab, and we'll select Create Route Table. Okay. Now we're given this default route, right, which says we can reach anything in our VPC. So again, at the beginning of my lecture, I said that we could SSH while we're in the EC2 instance in the public subnet, right? We have a PuTTY session. We can SSH into the private subnet, right? Because both these instances have private IPs. The public EC2 also has a public IP, but they also have a route, a local route, which allows them to communicate. Okay, so we have that, right? So here's what makes the subnet public, right? When we go subnet associations, we click Edit Subnet Association, we add the public subnet, we save it, okay? So you got your subnet association to the public route, and then you have to edit the route, and you have to add the route. Once you add the quad 0 and specify your internet gateway, which is Endpoint IGW, and click Save, wrong one. This is the video. Here we go. Once you do that, this is officially a public subnet, right? Even though we haven't created any EC2 instance, right? So we got a public subnet and we attach the gateway to it, okay? So we've done this part. We've done the green and we've done the internet gateway, okay? We created the private subnet, okay? Now all we need to do is look at the route table for the private subnet. And we want to add a private route table. So we're going to click on create route, and we're going to call it private-RT. We're going to select our VPC, Endpoint Lab VPC, and we're going to create route. Okay, and for now, we haven't created the endpoint yet. Eventually, we're going to say if the destination is the S3 bucket, right? If the destination is this S3 bucket, then the EC2 and the private subnet should send it to the endpoint that we haven't created yet. Okay, so we don't add, there's no endpoint to add because we haven't created it yet. All right, so what we'll do now is we'll create our two EC2 instances and we'll create our S3 bucket. And then at the very end, we'll create our endpoint. Okay, so we got everything set up. Make sure I got my subnet association. See, I almost forgot it. So for the private route table, right, click on subnet associations, click on edit, select the private subnet and save it. Okay, now we're good to go. All right, so in the search, we'll type EC2. And we have 0 instances running. Okay, and we'll select launch instance. And we will do the public one first. We'll call this public-Linux-server. We'll use Amazon Linux. The machine image, AMI, free tier eligible. T2 micro. Now we're going to want to create a key pair. Okay, and both instances are going to use the same key pair because they're going to connect to each other eventually, right? You're going to be logged on to the public instance and you're going to want to SSH into the private instance. So we'll go create a new key pair and we will call this endpoint key pair lab. And I put dashes between them and make sure you select PPK and select create. Okay, and then you'll have it there. It's been downloaded. All right, so next step is click the network settings. You want to click edit and you want to change the VPC to the Endpoint Lab VPC. And this is the public EC2, so you want to select the public subnet, right? So it's a public Linux server. We want it in the public subnet, which is in US East 1A. And there's your CEDAR, your subnet address right there. Okay, this is going to have a public IP, right? Because it's in a public subnet. So we're going to select enable for auto assign public IP. We're going to create a security group and we'll just select the existing security group. Oh, we'll create a security group. I'm sorry. Just leave it at create security group. We don't have one. And we'll just change the name to endpoint-lab-sg for security group. And we'll copy that and we'll paste it into the description. Okay, and we have an inbound rule. Okay, we're going to allow SSH from anywhere. And we'll also add another security group rule in which we will allow ICMP. So change custom IP to all ICMP. And the source type will be custom. And we want to specify that we can ping anything in our VPC, but not anything outside our VPC. So you can type the default 10.0.0.0/16, and you will be able to ping. The instances will be able to ping each other, okay? Because they all have network addresses beginning with 10.0, okay? And that's how the rule inspects the packet, okay, because that's what we're specifying here. All right, so we got the security group, we got SSH, we got ICMP. And let's go to advanced network configuration. Let's double check that. I think that looks good. Storage is good. Let's go to advanced details. And we want to select the IAM instance profile. We want to select lab instance profile. Okay, and then that should be it. And we'll select launch instance. Let's just make sure it launched okay. Let's click on EC2. We'll create our second instance. So we'll select launch instance again. And we'll call it private Linux instance. Okay, and we want to select Amazon Linux again. AMI is the same. T2 micro is the same. Key pair, we want to select the same key pair, which is the one we just created, Endpoint Key Pair Lab. Okay, make sure it says Endpoint Key Pair Lab. Click on Edit for network setting. Select our Endpoint Lab VPC. We want to make sure it's in the private subnet. Okay, so that's US East 1B, right? 10.0.2.0. And of course, it's a private EC2 instance in a private subnet. It's not going to have a public IP, so that's disabled. Okay, now we want to select an existing security group and click the drop down arrow and select Endpoint Lab security group. Okay, scroll down to advanced details. And for instance profile, select lab instance profile and scroll down, and we'll launch the private instance. Okay, so that was successful. Click on EC2, click on instances running, hit refresh, and we got two that are in the process of initializing. So while we're waiting for those instances to initialize, we will go ahead and select our S3 bucket. We'll create one. We'll select S3. We will click on it. And we will select Create Bucket. And we'll give it a name. We'll call it Bucket-Lab-Endpoint. Bucket-Endpoint Lab, right? Because it's a lab about the endpoint. Also some other things as well, right? We're going to enable versioning, create a lifecycle policy, and how to upload files to the bucket from an EC2 instance, okay? ACLs will be disabled. We'll block all public access because, again, everything's going to be within the Amazon network. And so we want to enable versioning, and we'll leave everything the same, and we'll select Create Bucket. Oh, try it again. Oh, must not contain. That's right. Bucket-Endpoint-Lab. Okay, and now Create Bucket. Okay, so our bucket's been created. Now we're going to click on it. And for objects, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a folder, okay, to place our files to. And let's just call it Daily Polling Data. Call it whatever you want. It doesn't have to be that. And select Create Folder. Now what you want to do is select it, and we'll need this later. We want to copy the S3 URL. Let's open up a Notepad doc. We're going to need this later when we want to upload and download files to it. And I got to read me text. All right, and we'll copy and paste that endpoint. You know, let's not put any spaces. That's going to throw it off. So See if I can edit this folder. Because Linux doesn't allow spaces with names, and that's could throw off the command line. So let's just delete the folder, and we'll confirm it. Okay, and so now we have no objects. So let's close this, and let's try it again. Create folder, and we'll call it daily polling data without any spaces, and we'll create it. Okay, now we'll highlight it and copy the S3 URL and delete this, and we'll paste it into a notepad document. Okay, got everything we need. All right, so if you go to properties of our bucket, we want to make sure bucket versioning is enabled. If not, if you forgot to do it, you can click edit and enable versioning, and we'll go to management. Now we're going to create since we'll enable versioning, we're going to allow multiple files, older documents with the same file name to be stored, right? So you could have 10 files with the same file name, right? And you'll see the most recent one and the 9 older ones, but you can create a lifecycle policy that says, what do you want to do with the older ones? Okay. And so we're going to create a lifecycle rule, and we're going to call it a name. We'll call it lab lifecycle policy dash Glacier. We'll send everything to Glacier. Okay, and we want to apply to all objects in the bucket, and you want to acknowledge that. Okay, and you want to transition the current versions of objects between storage classes, or transition the non-current versions of objects between storage classes. So we want to select the second one. Okay, because you're going to have the most recent document and you're going to have 9 older ones. So what you're saying here is take those 9 older ones, and those 9 older ones will follow a lifecycle policy. Okay, now you would incur a cost, right? Because when you transfer something to S3 or S3 standard and frequent access or Glacier, there's a charge, right? But Glacier is your most cost-effective choice. Okay, so you got standard and frequent access. You could do that, and you got a flexible retrieval. Okay, so you can read these and see which one that would apply to you, and you could have a deep archive, and it takes a while. Like it takes hours to retrieve a document from Glacier. But if you're not going to need those 9 older ones, then that might be the most cost beneficial solution. So again, which one of these you choose is the document itself, those older documents, and how often do you think how often do you think you're going to need to access them? So I'll choose Glacier Deep Archive, and we'll say after 180 days, send those 9 older documents to Glaciers. Number of newer versions to retain. Okay, we can just, if you want to keep the latest 2, right? And so if you have 10 and you want to keep the 2 newest, then you could select 2 here. Okay, but we'll just leave that as is. It's optional. Okay, and we'll say create a rule. Okay, now that lifecycle policy is enabled. Okay, so let's go back to our EC2s. They should be both up and running now. Okay, so in order to SSH from an EC2 in a public subnet to another EC2 in a private subnet via PuTTY, there's 2 things you need to do. One on PuTTY is you need to enable forwarding, right? So you could forward an SSH request from the EC2 you're at in the public subnet to the EC2 in the private subnet. but you also need to carry that key with you, right? Yes, they both have the same key, but you have to bring that key, right, to the private subnet in which the EC2 resides, okay? So there's two utilities you need to download, okay? It's Putty. You may already have Putty, and there's another one called Pageant, okay? And I'm going to show you the link. You just click on a new tab in your browser. In the Google search, type download Pageant, okay? And it's the first link, okay? Once you click on it, just select the first one, the Microsoft installer, and it will install it, okay? It'll go through the process of installing it for you. I already have it installed, but all you would need to do is click on it, okay? And it's downloaded. And if I go to my downloads folder, show you what it looks like. That's what it looks like. I'm not going to install it because, as you can see, I've already installed it. Okay, and once you click on it and install it, okay, then your next task, right, click the Windows Start. You could search for Pageant. You could right click on it and you could say pin to taskbar. Mine's already pinned. So you pin it to taskbar and then you search for Putty, right click, and then again you would pin it to your taskbar. Okay, so you can do that. And once you do that, this is what your Putty utility looks like on the taskbar. It's two computers. The Pageant one has a computer with a hat on it, right? But the way we're going to access Pageant and load the lab key is through the smaller one, right? You see this arrow here? You click that, and then you would right click on Pageant and you would add a key. Okay, we'll do that later. Okay, so with that done and your EC2s are done, the next step is to create the endpoint. Okay, I'm going to close this tab, and so we got both our instances running. It's kind of like our last step. We're going to type endpoint. Our last step before we test everything. Okay, we're going to click on Endpoint Services. And we're going to scroll down until we find endpoints. I might have passed it. There it is. See where it says endpoints here on the left? Okay, it's towards the top. Click on it. And you want to create endpoint. Not create endpoint service, but create endpoint. And we're going to give it a name. And we'll call it Lab Endpoint for VPC, or just Lab Endpoint's good enough, okay? And you want to leave the type to AWS services. And then you want to search for S3 because you want to create an endpoint so the instance in the private subnet could access the S3 bucket. And the way to do that, so the endpoint becomes the gateway, right, so to speak, right? The public subnet has an internet gateway in which it can access the S3 bucket. The private subnet will have a VPC endpoint that will serve as its gateway, right? It's not an internet gateway, it's a VPC endpoint that just kind of like a gateway. So it could, S3 bucket can be accessed from the private subnet. So services, just type S3 and hit enter, and we'll do a search. And you want to select the second option, the gateway, right? It should say com.amazon news, and you want to make sure it says US East 1, right? So it doesn't matter if it's 1A or 1B, but it's US East 1.S3. Okay, so make sure that's selected. Okay, select your VPC, which is your Endpoint Lab VPC. Now you want to select the private route table, not the public route table. Public route table, we already have a gateway, internet gateway route with that quad 0 address, right? The private subnet doesn't have anything. This is all set up for access. Okay, so you want to select the private route table. We want to allow full access, and we want to create the endpoint. Okay, so that endpoint is created. It should be available. You want to make sure that the VPC ID is your endpoint lab VPC that you created, okay? And then you have your route table, which is the private route table, right? Ends in A7, okay? So we click on route tables here, and notice the private route table. Notice it ends in A7, so it matches what we have up here, okay? If you click on the route table ID, okay, we want to hit refresh. It should pop up. Okay, if not, we can manually create it. We can, oh no, click on the route table ID again. There it is, I'm sorry. So the destination, this is actually the S3 bucket that we created, and the target is the VPC endpoint, okay? And the subnet association is the private subnet. So it's been created. Now, if you can look at this lab topology here, this X has been replaced with the VPC endpoint for S3, and you could literally replace the X with that, and then you could draw a line to Amazon S3. We have our connection, okay? So that's all set up, okay? The last thing to do is simply SSH into our public server. We'll SSH into the public EC2, right? We'll create a file on Linux, and we will upload that file to the internet gateway. Okay, so the file that we create and upload will pass from the EC2 to the internet gateway to the S3 bucket, okay, inside that folder that we created, okay, because we copied the bucket endpoint, okay, and so let's just go ahead and do that, and we click on EC2s. And we'll click on instances running. And we'll click on the public Linux server because, again, it has a private IP, which will allow it to communicate with the private instance, but it has a public IP, which means it goes through an internet gateway. So we copy the public IPv4 address, and then we go to PuTTY. Okay, there's some things we do. Okay, the first thing we'll do is we'll go to Pageant, and we got to carry that private key so we can connect to the private instance eventually. So we'll click on Pageant, right click, and select Add Key, and select the Endpoint Key Pair Lab, okay, and select Open, okay. That's what you do. That's the only thing you need to do with Pageant. Click on PuTTY. Okay, now we have to allow forwarding of SSH requests. So click on SSH, click on AUTH, and put a check mark on Allow Agent Forwarding. Okay, once you've done that, click the plus sign on AUTH, click on Credentials, browse for your key, select the same key pair, and select Open. And now go to your session. At the very top, click on Session and paste in that public IP and select Open. And we're going to select Accept. And for your login, okay, we're going to type in EC2-user and hit Enter. And then you're logged in. Okay, so a couple of things, right? In Linux, we can actually upload files. We don't have to be the root to upload files, okay, to an S3 bucket. But here's some things to know, right? So when you're creating files and you're uploading files, right, you either have to be at the directory you're working at, or you have to specify the full path name of the directory. Okay, so for example, if you type pwd, which stands print working directory. It lets us know that we're in our username folder, EC2 user, right, which is our home folder. We can create folders and directories there, kind of like our cubby hole to create whatever we want in there. That's under the home folder, which lists all the username. And at the very top of the file structure is the /root. Okay, those of you who've taken the Linux class, you probably are familiar with that. And if you haven't, you'll learn about that more in detail. Okay, so we won't get fancy. What we'll do is we'll create some blank text files. We will type touch. We'll just create one because we'll create another one on the other EC2. We'll type touch, and we'll call this document 1. Okay, and that creates a blank text file called document 1. All right, and if you want to verify what's in your working directory, if you want to see the contents of your directory, type ls, and you can see that we have a file there called document 1. Okay, now we're going to copy that file to the bucket that we created, the S3 bucket. So we're going to type AWS S3 CP document 1, and then we're going to hit the space bar. Okay, and then we're going to specify that endpoint that we copied earlier in our notepad, and we're going to right click, hit the right arrow on your keyboard, and just go ahead and hit enter. Okay, and the upload was successful. Okay, so what I should have shown you first is how do you know you have connectivity to the bucket? Let's just say this command didn't work. Okay, and to verify you can connect to a bucket, you type AWS S3 ls. Okay, and when you see the bucket name, Bucket Endpoint Lab, that lets you know you can connect to it. So if the command didn't work, check the syntax of your command, right? Maybe the spacing's off. Okay, so the document has been copied to your S3 bucket. All right, now what we want to do is SSH. So real briefly, so we created a text file on the public EC2 instance called document 1. We uploaded that file through the internet gateway and into the S3 bucket. Okay. Now what we want to do is from the EC2 instance in the public subnet, we want to SSH into the EC2 instance in the private subnet, because again, we can't use PuTTY from our home computer because it doesn't have a public IP, right? So let's go to our private EC2 instance. Let's click on EC2. Instance is running. And now take the check mark off public and put it on private. And if you scroll down, right, you'll see here, there's no public IP address, right? You only have a private IP. So we want to copy that, okay? And given that we set up Pageant and forwarding of our session, we should be able to PuTTY in, SSH in to the EC2 instance in the private subnet. So again, you can look at the IP address, right? That lets you know this is the EC2 instance in the public subnet. 10.0.1 is the public subnet. Okay, so how do you SSH into the EC2 instance in the private subnet? You can SSH space, type the username, by default EC2-user, then type the @ and right click and select that private IP and hit enter. Okay, so I need to double check that. Okay, SSH EC2 user. Okay, let me pause the video while I figure that out. Okay, I know what I did wrong. I'm copying the instance in the public subnet, has both a public, maybe some of you caught it, but the instance in the public subnet has a public and private IP, right? That we talked about. And I accidentally selected the private IP for the public subnet. So I'm trying to SSH into myself, right? More or less. And that was the problem. Okay. So all the commands that we did on the public server with uploading the document work. And I'm going to end my putty session. I'm going to just start it from scratch. So you'll get to see how we do it. Okay. So click on the private instance and copy that private IPv4 address. Again, wrong one. Right? The private instance has a private IP. That's what we have to SSH into. Okay? We were able to SSH into the public instance using the public IP, but I accidentally selected the private IP of this public instance to try to SSH into the instance in the private subnet, right? So my mistake, right? I was checking a lot of things, but for about 5 minutes, but obviously I had to figure it was something obvious. Anyway, okay, so make sure you select the private IP address in the private subnet, okay? And so you can copy that, okay? So it's been copied. Now go to your putty session. If you're already in, okay, just bear with me for a second. I'm going to SSH into the public server again. And I won't make the same mistake twice. We're going to right click and go paste. Okay, and then we're going to click on the plus on SSH. We're going to click on AUTH. You got to allow agent forwarding. You got to click on that again. Click the plus sign in AUTH. Go to credentials. Go to browse and select Endpoint Key Pair Lab. Okay. Now we have everything done. We can open our session and we'll log in as EC2 user. Okay, now we're logged into the instance on the public subnet, which is where you're at now. Okay, you're at 10.0.1. something. Okay, this is the instance in the public subnet. So we want to SSH. And again, with Pagent, right, you can right click on Pagent and view your keys, right? And it should say Endpoint Key Pair Lab. Okay, so you got that set up. The next step is to click on the private. This is what I failed to do. Click on the private instance and select the private IP and go back to your putty session and type SSH EC2-user at and right click and type in that private IP that's in the private subnet and hit enter. Okay, and then you're in. You're going to have to type yes to acknowledge it, and then you're in. And you know you're in the EC2 instance in the private subnet because of the IP address that you see, 10.0.2, right? So you know you're actually USSH from here to here. And now we want to make sure our VPC endpoint works. So we want to see if we can connect, if we can see the Amazon S3 bucket, right? Because now we have a VPC endpoint for S3. So what we want to do is go ahead and key in AWS S3 LS. Okay, and when you see the bucket name, well, guess what? You went through that VPC endpoint to connect to that bucket, right? So that X, again, is replaced by a VPC endpoint. You went from the EC2 in the private to the VPC endpoint, right, to S3. And you did that without even needing a public IP, right? So that's the benefit of VPC endpoints. Okay, now we'll go ahead and create some files. Okay, so again, PWD, your current working directory. Again, if you wanted to create a directory from here, if you type MKDIR and type your first name, okay, and hit enter. Now, if you want to switch to that directory, type CD. I'm going to teach you something too, right? There's something called relative path name. So since we're already here and we only need to jump one step to the John directory, we could type CD John, okay? And that takes me there. And look how my prompt changes. However, let's just say I'm in another directory. Let's say I want to go to the very top of my file structure, the root directory, which is here, and hit enter. You see how my prompt changes? Now, because I got to go more than 2 steps, right? You have to type what's called the absolute path name, the full file path. I have to type CD space /home /EC2 user /John to switch to that directory. Okay, now I'm back in there again. I type ls. I have no files in there. I can create files in there. I'll type touch. We will call this letter instead of document, letter 1, and hit enter. Okay, now we'll copy that letter to an S3 bucket. There's nothing in there. It's a blank text file, but we will type the command AWS S3 CP. Now remember, if we weren't at this directory, we would have to type the full path name, home, EC2 user, then John, then letter 1. We would have to type the full, but you don't have to do that because you're already here. Okay, so this introductory Linux lesson, right? Relative path names versus absolute path names. Okay, and if you haven't taken a Linux class, you'll learn more about that. Okay, so we type AWSCP, the file name we created, letter 1, and then again, we want to copy that bucket endpoint into our daily polling data file. So we copy this, right click, hit the right arrow on your keyboard, and hit enter. And the letter has been uploaded. Okay, so what if you add something to the letter? You get different versions and you want to upload the same letter, right? So we enabled versioning, which means there'll be 2 letter ones, right? A newer version and an older version. And we created a lifecycle policy that says the older versions will go to Amazon Glacier after 180 days, okay, for permanent file storage. So let's just edit it real quick. So you could add something in there, type VI space letter 1, hit enter, hit I for insert mode, and you could type anything you want here. You could just say candidate A -51%, enter, candidate B -49%, hit enter, okay? And then to save it, hit the escape key, takes you out of insert mode into command mode, hold the shift key down, make the colon. You can see it at the bottom there, and type WQ exclamation point and hit enter, okay? Now, we want to upload a newer version of that letter, right? So hit the up arrow. You don't have to type that copy command again. There's a command history recall. Hit the up arrow once, hit the up arrow twice, and hit enter. Okay, so the last thing to do is look at our S3 bucket and see the effect of versioning. Okay, so we're going to type S3. And there's our bucket endpoint lab. We're going to click on it, and we're going to click on daily polling data. Okay, and then if you click on letter 1, click the plus sign and click on it. Okay, you could see the version IDs of that file, right? There's actually two versions, and you got the current version and you got this older version right here, right? And so our life cycle policy says this version right here, right? If it hasn't been after 180 days, it'll get uploaded to Amazon Glacier, okay? But you're also free to delete versions. So this is the properties of just letter one, okay? And so if you go back to daily polling data, you click on letter one, okay? And you can download it, and then you can open it. And let's just say Notepad just once. Okay, there's your candidate A and candidate B. Okay, close all this. All right, so again, right, to view the versioning, you click on letter one, you get the properties of letter one, and you versions, you get the current version, and you get the old version. Okay, and so you can maintain, many versions. Like if you're going to have polling data for like 60 days before an election, right? And then you could obviously you'd want to enable versioning in your S3 bucket. Okay, so we need to break down the lab, but that completes the lab. You get to see how you can upload buckets and enable versioning and create a lifecycle policy. And the differences now between a public subnet and a private subnet. I hope you understand that better, right? So traffic in a public subnet, this EC2 has a public IP, goes through an internet gateway, right, to an S3 bucket, okay? The costs are not expensive when you use an internet gateway, okay? But if you have an instance in a private subnet, it doesn't have a public address. And again, right, you got two options. You can create a NAT gateway, right, which is like a router in your home. Your laptop at home, for example, has a private IP, but when you access the internet to do this lab, it gets converted to a public IP. That's a NAT gateway. Everybody's got one in their home. That's one option. But if you don't want traffic really to go through the internet and stay within the Amazon network without any public IP address needed, right? Because you only have a private IP here, you can create a VPC endpoint, which can connect to S3, and you can store files in your bucket, okay? So we will begin the process of breaking down the lab. And so the first thing that we'll do is we'll go to our endpoint bucket lab. We'll click on daily polling data, and we gotta select delete. You gotta delete all the files first before you can delete the folder, I believe. So you click delete objects. Okay, they're gone. Let's go click close, and let's refresh. Okay, and go to the bucket endpoint lab. Now we can delete the folder because there's nothing in there. Click delete and confirm it. Deletes the folder. Kind of have to do it one by one, right? Click close. All right, go to your buckets, and now you can delete the actual bucket by clicking delete here, and you have to type in the name. I wonder if it lets you copy and paste that. I know it does on EC2s and other, no. They said bucket's not empty, so, it's the versionings. We didn't delete those older versions. Okay, so we copy permanent delete, paste it in here. Okay, now we can go back to the S3 bucket. Click on buckets again, bucket endpoint lab, and now you can delete it. And I think it'll let us copy it in here. Paste that in, and delete bucket, it's gone. And then you get this create bucket like welcome message here. All right, and you can close that tab. And now what we want to do is go to our VPC. You know what? We'll delete the EC2 instances. We'll do EC2. Let's close our putty session. Okay, so one thing, keep those putty and pageant icons in your taskbar because you're going to need them for the 3300 lab. Okay, that's more geared towards the Amazon Web Solutions Architect certification that we're trying to prepare you for. And we're having good success rates on the cloud practitioner exam pass rate for those who attend the boot camp. So just keep that in mind, right? I recommend after you complete NetC 3301 and 3302 is you sign up for the boot camp and get AWS certified as a cloud practitioner, because this is what these two courses are preparing you for. And I know we're showing you a lot and we're not really sticking with really one thing and building upon it, but there's a lot to show. And it's important that you know a little as much as possible, right? You're not going to learn a lot about one thing in these two classes, but you're going to learn a little about everything. Okay, so we'll click on instances running. We can select both. We can delete them both at a time. And go to instance state and select terminate instance. Okay, and they're shutting down in the process of being terminated. Okay, so now we can go to our VPC. We type VPC. Our bucket's been deleted. Our EC2s have been deleted. Click on VPCs. And first thing we want to do is disassociate the subnet associations for the private and public routes. So for the private route table, click on the route table ID, click on subnet associations, and click edit subnet association, delete the private subnet, click save. Okay, and then go back to route tables, click on the public route, and click subnet association, click edit subnet association, delete the subnet, and click save. Okay, now go to the private route and let's click edit routes and we can delete that later. Hang on, let's just hit cancel there. Okay, wonder why it's not that local route's not. Oh, I see. Okay, there it is. All right, so we're fine here. Our next step after we delete the subnet association is go to your internet gateway, click on the endpoint IGW, go to actions, detach it from the VPC, right? And now you can delete your internet gateway. Go to actions and select delete internet gateway and confirm that with the delete. Okay, and let's go to endpoints. Click on lab endpoint and select delete VPC endpoint. Click delete. Okay, and we're getting there, right? And then I don't know if we need to delete the routes. Probably don't have to. No, we don't have to do it from here. I think we're good to go. We should be able to go to the VPC, and from your VPC, select Endpoint Lab VPC and select Delete VPC. Okay, great. We want to delete all that. Yes, we do. The routes and the subnets. So type in delete. Okay, so that concludes the lab. The security groups should be gone. Yep, you have a default security group, so we are good there. Okay, so again, that completes the lab. Thank you.